Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the next stage of the React lifecycle. So we've talked about the mounting phase. So the very first time your component shows up, there's a couple things that happen before it. There's a constructor that's run, the very first render, and then ComponentDidMount is called afterwards. So we've already talked about that. But most of the time, our content, our data is changing. So things that could trigger a change are set state, which we've seen. Anytime you set the state in a component, at least with what we know right now, it causes a re-render. The render method is called again. However, another thing that could cause a re-render, an update, is if the props change. So that doesn't mean we actually change the props in the component because they're immutable, we don't change them, but they could be passed in from a parent component with new values, like the to-do list we've seen, where we created our parent to-do list, it rendered dumb stateless child components, it passed in props. And if the parent state changed, it would pass in new props to the child to-do item. And that would cause a re-render of the to-do item. So if a component gets new props, or we call set state on that component, we are going to re-render, causing an update. In addition, there's something called force update we haven't seen yet. It's useful when you have data that is not part of the state, it's not a prop, and it's changing. So some external data, and you want to manually force a render, a re-render, then you can call force update. But for the most part, set state and new props are the two events, the two things that will cause an update with what we're working on. So one of these happens, re-render, then ComponentDidUpdate is called. So this is another lifecycle method that we can add, and React will call it every time the component is updated. So it's not called the very first time something is rendered, that's ComponentDidMount, but every other time afterwards, whenever there's a render, ComponentDidUpdate is called. And this is a good place to implement any side effect operations. For example, syncing up with local storage or any database. If something changes on your application, then after it's updated, you can go send that data off and say, hey, here's the new to-do that was just added. Save it to the database, something like that. Auto-saving, sort of the same thing I just said. Also, updating the DOM if you're working with uncontrolled components. Not something we're going to go into very much, but if you do have uncontrolled components, that is a place that you can update the DOM manually. So if we go to our loading icon, the Zen quote.js example, I'm going to add in a component did update, and I'm going to keep it super simple, console.log inside component did update. So we've seen this before. I'm going to add a bunch of console.logs. All right, so I have a console.log in constructor that says in constructor, and then in render, and then another one in ComponentDidMount, and then another one in ComponentDidUpdate. So the flow of our app here is that it's rendered once at the beginning, and then ComponentDidMount is called, which is going to then get new data. After 3 seconds, it will call set state. So after 3 seconds, we should then see ComponentDidUpdate. So I'm going to comment out the stuff we had before, the GitHub user info components, and just add in our Zen quote. Now if we head over to the console, refresh the page, we see inside constructor, inside render, ComponentDidMount, and then re-rendered because something changed, and then ComponentDidUpdate was called. So the render happens first. So we set the state. Inside ComponentDidMount, we get the data, we set the state, we changed the quote, and also the loading is loading Boolean value, and then that caused a re-render because the state was changed. So we called render again, or it was called for us. And then after that update happened, inside ComponentDidUpdate. So that's all I'll mention about ComponentDidUpdate for now. In the next video, I'll show you how it works in a slightly more complicated example. We're going to go back to that to-do list app, and you'll see that we actually have access to the previous props in previous state if we want to do some comparisons inside of ComponentDidUpdate to see what changed, or if nothing changed, or do something, or just to make some decision based off of the old state versus the new state.